A DNA ancestry test result destroyed everything my family told me about who I am. The results loaded at 6:43 in the morning, and I was still in my work clothes from the night before, sitting at my kitchen table with cold coffee because I had been on a project deadline and had not slept. The Ancestry DNA kit had been a birthday gift from my sister Adaze 3 months earlier, one of those gifts that arrives wrapped in cheerful practicality. She had done her own test the previous year and found a distant cousin in Lisbon she was delighted about, and she thought I would enjoy the same kind of mild genealogical surprise. I had submitted the kit in a spirit of mild curiosity and had largely forgotten about it. So when the notification email arrived and I opened the results tab, I was not braced for anything. That is the honest answer. I was sitting there in yesterday's shirt with cold coffee and zero psychological preparation for what I was about to read. The ethnicity breakdown loaded first, a pie chart my brain processed, and then refused to accept for approximately 4 full seconds, which is a long time when the alternative explanation is that the chart is wrong and the actual alternative is that your entire family history is a fabrication. I put the coffee down carefully on the table. I looked at the screen. I looked at it again. I need to tell you about who I thought I was before I took the screen said, because the distance between those two things is where the whole story lives. My name is Kofi Asante Breen. I am 34 years old. I was raised in a mid-sized city in Ohio by two parents. My father, Kwame Asante Breen, a structural engineer, and my mother, Loretta Asante Breen, who ran a small catering business from our home kitchen. My father's family had emigrated from Ghana in the 1960s. His parents arrived in the United States with credentials that Ohio did not initially recognize and had spent years rebuilding professional standing from scratch before ultimately achieving a stability they were fiercely proud of. My mother's family was Black American, multiple generations, Southern roots that had migrated north during the first Great Migration. I had grown up with both of these histories presented as foundational truths about who I was. I spoke of them with the confident ownership of a person who has had something his whole life, and therefore assumes it is simply his. I had Ghanaian proverbs from my grandfather, Thanksgiving recipes from my maternal grandmother that were non-negotiable, a family reunion every 2 years in Georgia that pulled together cousins I saw only then but recognized immediately. I knew my history. I had been raised inside it like a house. The pie chart showed 0% West African ancestry, 0%. In a result that was otherwise a specific and coherent combination of English, Irish, and a small percentage of Scandinavian, the kind of ancestry result that belongs to a person from a very different family than the one I thought I had. I stared at it. I clicked away and came back. I cleared the browser cache and reloaded it because that is apparently what a person does when the alternative to a browser glitch is a fundamental reordering of reality. The result was the same. I sat at my kitchen table at 6:43 in the morning and felt something in my chest that I did not have language for. Not quite panic, not quite grief. Something more like the sensation of a floor that has always been solid revealing itself to be suspended over nothing. The first thing I did was call the lab. Not my family, the lab. I am a person who goes to source documentation first, which is a professional habit that occasionally serves me well outside the office. And this was one of those occasions. I work as a civil engineer, which is not relevant to the DNA question, but is relevant to how I approach problems, methodically, with a preference for structural analysis over emotional reaction, at least initially. I called Ancestry DNA's customer service line at 8 a.m. and spent 40 minutes with a representative who walked me through the quality control process and confirmed that the test had been processed correctly, that the sample integrity was flagged as good, and that the results reflected the genomic data extracted from my saliva sample. She offered to issue a free retest, which I accepted. But she also told me carefully that retests of valid samples almost always return consistent results. I asked her how confident she was that the results were accurate. She said, "The methodology is over 99.9% accurate for the ethnicity estimates we provide." I thanked her and hung up and called Adaze. Adaze is 2 years older than me, a nurse practitioner, precise and practical, and the member of our family most likely to say the thing other people are avoiding. I told her what the results showed. She was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough that I checked the call was still connected. Then she said, "Have you talked to mom and dad?" I said, "Not yet." She said, "Don't do it over the phone." She said she would come. She arrived at my apartment 4 hours later, and she had brought her own Ancestry DNA results on her phone. She had pulled them up on the drive over. I had not thought to ask about her results. Her results showed the same pattern mine did. No West African ancestry. The same English-Irish-Scandinavian combination, in proportions nearly identical to mine. The two of us sat in my living room and looked at our respective phones, and then at each other, and did not speak for a full minute. What we were both computing, separately, quietly, simultaneously, was that this was not a story about a family history that had been embellished or simplified. This was a story about something more fundamental. We had been raised by two people who were our parents in every lived sense of the word, by people we loved and trusted completely, inside a family history that did not biologically belong to us. I want to be careful here because there are several things the DNA results did not tell us, and those absences matter. They did not tell us we were adopted, though that was one possibility. They did not tell us anything had been done to us without consent or care. They did not tell us we were not Kwame and Loretta's children in any sense that had ever governed how we were raised or loved. What they told us was that the biological narrative we had been given was not accurate and that our parents knew this and had chosen not to tell us for reasons we did not yet understand. I am being careful to hold that distinction because I held it at the time, even while the anger was real and the disorientation was real, and the specific grief of watching a self-story dissolve is a grief I would not wish on anyone. I held the distinction. It helped, somewhat. We drove to my parents' house on a Saturday. Both of us. We did not call ahead, which was deliberate. Adaze and I discussed it and agreed that calling ahead would give our parents time to prepare a version of the conversation rather than having the actual one. My father answered the door in his gardening clothes, which he wears on Saturday mornings because he has maintained a kitchen garden for as long as I can remember, and the specific dissonance of his familiar gardening clothes and what I was holding in my hands made my chest tighten in a way I controlled by focusing on the path from the door to the living room. My mother came from the kitchen when she heard our voices, drying her hands on a dish towel, and when she saw both of us standing there at 10 in the morning unannounced, something happened in her face, a very rapid sequence of expressions that I had never seen from her before, moving through surprise into recognition and then into something that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it. She had been waiting for this. I understood from that sequence of expressions that she had been waiting for this for a very long time. My father sat down when I showed him the results. Not the way you sit down when you are tired, the way you sit down when your legs have made a decision your brain hasn't caught up with yet. My mother remained standing, her hand still holding the dish towel, and she said my name once quietly in the tone of a person beginning a sentence they have rehearsed and are now discovering they do not know how to finish. What came out over the next 2 hours was not a single clean explanation but a series of pieces that assembled slowly into a picture I had not imagined. Adaze and I had been adopted, not through an agency, not through any formal documented process, but through a private arrangement made in 1989 and 1991 respectively, organized through a woman named Ruth Opong, who had been a friend of my mother's from church. Ruth Opong, my parents told us, had connections to a network that facilitated private placements for women who could not or did not want to go through formal channels. My biological mother, a woman my parents knew only as a first name, Sierra, had been, according to what they were told at the time, a young woman in crisis who had specifically requested that her children be placed with a family that would raise them with a strong cultural identity. My father's family, his Ghanaian roots, his pride in that heritage had been presented to Ruth Opong as exactly the kind of home Sierra had wanted. The name, the history, the proverbs, and the family gatherings and the Georgia reunions. All of it had been given to us as birthright, with love, with the full intention that it become ours. But it had not been told to us as a gift, it had been told to us as fact. I will not describe what those 2 hours in my parents' living room were like in detail, because the emotional content of them belongs to my family, and I have already shared enough of it. What I will tell you is that I left that house carrying 2 new pieces of information and 1 persistent question. The first piece was the name Ruth Opong, who is still alive now 71 years old, still in the same city we had all grown up in. The second was a first name, Ciara, and the knowledge that she had been Irish American, which explained the ancestry result with a specificity that hit me somewhere in the solar plexus. The question was whether Ciara was still alive and whether she knew she had 2 grown children who had just found out she existed. I found Ruth Opong in 4 days. She was listed in the phone directory. She had lived in the same house in the same neighborhood for 40 years, a fact that struck me as either very reassuring or very unaware, and I wasn't sure which. I called her on a Wednesday afternoon and identified myself. There was a silence on the line. Then she said, "I always wondered if you'd call." She agreed to meet with me, not by phone. She said some things shouldn't be said over the phone, which I respected because I agreed. She was a small woman with close-cropped gray hair and the specific bearing of someone who has carried a weight for a long time and has become so accustomed to it that she no longer remembers what it felt like to put it down. She told me what she knew, which was not everything, but was more than my parents had. Shira's full name was Shira Mulvey. She had been 22 when she relinquished me and 24 when she relinquished Adaze, facts that rearranged in a particular way that I don't need to explain. She had been a student, far from home, and the circumstances of her pregnancies were something Ruth said she had only partially disclosed. Ruth had a contact for Sierra from 15 years ago, an address in Massachusetts, possibly outdated. She gave it to me with the specific gravity of a person handing over something they have kept for a long time and are relieved to give to its proper owner. I want to describe the period between getting Ruth's information and making contact with Ciara, because it was approximately 3 weeks, and it was one of the most disorienting periods of my adult life. I saw my therapist, Dr. Baraka Osei, a clinical psychologist with 18 years of practice and a specialization in identity and adoption-related trauma, twice a week during this period. Dr. Osei helped me articulate something I had been circling, that my grief was not about the loss of the Ghanaian identity I had been given, because that identity had been real in the way that lived experience is real regardless of its documentary origins. My grandfather's proverbs were still proverbs I had heard in my grandfather's voice. The Georgia reunions were still a place where people who loved each other gathered. The cultural inheritance had been given to me with love, and I had lived inside it genuinely, and nothing about the DNA result changed the texture of those lived years. What I was grieving was something different, the right to have known my own story, to have been given the choice of how to hold multiple identities simultaneously rather than having one substituted for another without my knowledge or consent. My attorney, a woman named Grace Kowalczyk, who had 20 years of family law and adoption practice, helped me understand the legal landscape. The arrangement that had produced my adoption was, Grace told me after reviewing what I had, an informal private placement that would not have met the formal documentation requirements of any state adoption process in 1989. This meant, legally, that my adoption had not been formalized through any court or agency. I had been raised by Kwame and Loretta Asante Breen, who were my parents in every functional and emotional sense, but the legal instrument that would have recorded this formally did not appear to exist. Grace filed a request with the county probate court for a records search, which returned nothing consistent with an undocumented informal placement. She told me that this created certain legal complexities but no immediate crises, and that my priority, if I wished to pursue it, was making contact with Ciara Mulvey. She said, I want to be clear that you have every right to do this. Whatever arrangement was made in 1989, it was made without your consent, and you are an adult with a right to your own history. I found Ciara through a combination of Ruth's outdated address and a social media search that Adiezi conducted, because Adiezi is better at this than I am and insisted on being involved in every step, which I was grateful for. Ciara Mulvey was 57 years old, lived in Somerville, Massachusetts, worked as a school librarian, and had, it appeared from her public social media, a life that looked quiet and ordinary and full of books and a garden and a cat. She had no other children listed. I stared at her profile photograph for a long time. A woman with reddish-gray hair and the particular blue-gray eyes that I have also had my entire life, and that I had attributed to a genetic randomness I now understood was not random at all. I composed a message and deleted it 3 times before sending a version that was 4 sentences. Who I was, how I had found her, what I knew, and a request for contact if she was willing. I sent it on a Friday evening at 9:18 p.m. And then I went for a run at 9:19 because I needed to be moving. She replied at 11:43 the same night. The reply was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph said that she had thought about this possibility every year of her adult life, that she had registered with 3 different adoption reunion registries over the years, and had been told each time that there was no record of formal adoption to match, which she had understood to mean I had either not sought her, or that the informal nature of the placement had made formal matching impossible. The second paragraph said that she was willing to talk, that she was frightened, and that she was also, she wrote, more relieved than I know how to explain. I read it standing in my kitchen with my running shoes still on, and the adrenaline from the run mixing with something else entirely that moved through me in a single wave, and then settled into something I could not name, but recognized as significant. We spoke by video call on the following Sunday. Adiz was with me. Ciara was alone in what appeared to be her living room, sitting very straight, with her hands folded in her lap the way a person sits when they are trying to hold themselves together through effort rather than ease. She looked at both of us for a long moment before she spoke, and I watched her face do a series of things that I understood were the face of a woman seeing her children for the first time in 32 years and 34 years respectively. She said, "You both have my father's eyes." She said it quietly, and then pressed her lips together and took a breath, and I watched my sister Adaiz, who is the most practically composed person I know, produce tears she did not appear to have anticipated and did nothing to hide. The conversation lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes, and I will not recount all of it here, because it belongs to Ciara and to us, and not to a public account. What I will tell you is that the circumstances Ruth Opong had described as a woman in crisis were more specific and more serious than that description had suggested, and that understanding those circumstances did not produce forgiveness. I do not think forgiveness is the right frame for what happened, but it produced something that felt more like comprehension, which is different and in some ways more useful. The crisis when it came was not dramatic. It did not arrive with an arrest or a revelation at a public event. It arrived with a phone call from my father 3 weeks after the video call with Ciara at 7 in the morning. He had been contacted by a lawyer representing the estate of a man named Dermot Mulvey, Ciara's father, my biological grandfather, who had died 14 months earlier. The estate lawyer, in the process of finalizing the estate, had encountered documentation that Dermot Mulvey had prepared and notarized before his death. A formal statement acknowledging that he had a biological grandson and granddaughter named Kofi and Adiezi, that he had been aware of our existence since 1991, and that he wished for us to be informed of a provision he had included in his estate on our behalf. The provision was not enormous. It was $43,000, split between Adiezi and me, but that was not the point. The point was that Dermot Mulvey had known about us for 33 years and had chosen, until his death, not to make himself known to us, but had also chosen not to exclude us from his legacy. He had held us at a distance and acknowledged us in the same document. I sat with that complexity for a long time because it deserved that. The estate lawyer, a man named Patrick Hennessy with 26 years of probate practice in Massachusetts, contacted Adiezi and me directly once our identities were confirmed through the DNA evidence we provided. The same ancestry DNA results that had started everything, now serving as legal documentation in a probate proceeding. The irony of that was not lost on me. Patrick Hennessy processed the inheritance with what he described as unusual speed, explaining that Dermot Mulvey's documentation had been prepared with the apparent intention of minimizing delay, as though the man had understood that he was correcting an omission and had not wanted the correction to take longer than necessary. Adiezi and I received the funds 4 months after Dermot Mulvey's estate was filed for probate. We both donated portions of our shares to organizations working on open adoption records legislation, which was a decision we made together without needing to discuss it very much. What the DNA test destroyed in the end was a specific story about where I came from. A story I had loved, a story that had shaped me, a story that had been given to me with genuine love by people who remain my parents in every meaningful sense. What it revealed was a different and larger story, a woman named Ciara who had made an impossible choice at 22 and spent decades wondering what had become of it, a grandfather who had known and stayed silent and then couldn't stay entirely silent even in death, a network of informal arrangements that had shaped lives without ever generating the paperwork that would have made those lives legible to each other. The story the test destroyed was smaller than the one it revealed. That is not comfort exactly, but it is something. I have met Ciara in person twice. The first meeting was in Boston, on neutral ground, a restaurant Adiezi chose because she does better research than I do and wanted the geography to be right. Ciara arrived 12 minutes early and was already sitting when we got there, which told me something about her. We sat for 4 hours and ate very little. The second meeting was in Ohio, at my parents' house, which was Ciara's idea and which required a specific kind of courage from everyone in the room, including me. Mother and Ciara sat across from each other at the same kitchen table, where I had done my homework for 12 years and spoke for 2 hours, while Adiezi and I pretended to be busy in other parts of the house and were not busy at all. I don't know exactly what they said. I know that when I came back into the kitchen, both of them had been crying, and neither of them looked like they regretted the conversation. My father shook Ciara's hand at the door when she left, and held it for a moment longer than a handshake, and neither of them said anything. Some things don't need words. Some things need 30 years to get to the place where words aren't necessary. The DNA test cost $79. I keep the original result printout in a folder in my desk at home, not as a wound and not as a trophy, but as a document. Evidence of a morning at 6043, when the floor I was standing on turned out to be a different floor than the one I had mapped, and I had to learn to walk on it anyway, which I am still doing. My grandfather's proverbs are still mine. The Georgia reunions are still mine. Ciara's father's eyes are mine too, apparently, and so are the specific blue-gray irises my sister has had since birth that we used to attribute to a genetic wild card and now understand completely. Both things are mine. The world is large enough to hold both, if you are willing to stand in the place where they overlap and look in both directions at once. I am most days willing.